I'm GM Josh Friedel. I'll be doing my lecture on Insane in the Endgame. Um, and it'll be hopefully an interactive lecture where I can ask you guys questions. You can make suggestions. I'll be looking at the YouTube. So hey, Siddhant, how's it going? Regular guest to my own streams. In any case, welcome everyone. So today I wanted to go over some complex endgames. I felt simple to do simple endgames when it's insane in the endgame. But so I want to go over some complex endgames. These are endgames I've lectured on before and are some favorites of mine to work with, just because there are lots of complexities and they're just really fun to go over. They show lots of concepts. So the first one is from Carlsen Adams from the Baku FIDE Grand Prix in 2008. So this was when Carlsen was extremely strong, high 2700 player, not world champion yet, but already a fantastic technical player against Michael Adams, who was Britain's #1 and obviously a very strong player himself. And in this game, Carlsen was white, and already it's kind of an interesting position. Really, really complex. Lots of things going on here. So I would say that at the moment, white's down the exchange, and for absolutely nothing. Like, there's no pawn even. But I would say that white has a lot to offer for that exchange. White has a dominating knight on d4, which looks really nice. Beautiful bishops. I would say black has more weaknesses. The pawn on d5 is a bit weak. If it falls, the pawn on b7 would also be weak. The king on e7 is not exactly perfect. So there are lots of things that are not great about black's position and that are really nice about white's position. And again, I mean, to fully grasp like how an exchange sack affects the position is really difficult. But it's still not easy. Black's the only one with open file and does have the extra exchange, so it seems likely to be able to keep it. But it's a tricky position to figure out how to proceed, and one of the tricky things is to figure out exactly what you want to do with your pieces, because a lot of the times improving your pieces to the maximum is really important. So I guess the first question I'll ask you guys is, as white, what piece do you think needs to be improved the most, and how would you improve it? So again, I'm looking at the YouTube chat, so if you have suggestions, definitely make it there. So Hector Lopez recommends g2 to g4. And this would be a move that makes a lot of sense. So recommending this move. But the drawback to this, and the idea is you kick the rook from this square, right? And you're going to try to take this pawn, I'm assuming. The drawback to this move is that there's rook h2 check, and then your bishop falls on b2. So I would say that while that's a rather normal idea to try to play g4, it makes sense positionally, this rook h2 check idea is really annoying. So you probably want to find something else. Yeah, I mean, a move like b5 is definitely one to be considered. You have to be careful opening up the position too much, because sometimes that favors the rooks. And after a move like b5 is definitely a very interesting move here. Maybe black could try something like, I mean, let's see. So let's say b5, or that was not what he played in the game. Maybe a move like knight e5 is interesting. So I'm trying to fork you with knight d3 check. If you take on a6, I'll simply take back. The problem you have here is that if you look, the board becomes too open, sometimes it can be kind of annoying because the rooks will become very strong. You can try bishop a3, but probably I can sidestep with the king. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here, to be perfectly honest. It's a really crazy position, but b5 is definitely a very sensible move. But in this position, Carlsen instead decided to simply improve a piece, not to try to initiate any kind of complications. So bishop c2 definitely looks like it improves the bishop, but really you're trying to target this pawn on d5. And that's kind of the key here. You have to ask yourself, what is the main weakness black has? And to me, it's that pawn on d5. So what Carlsen's move does is it attempts to really go after and prove that black really does have this weakness. So rook d1 is a nice idea to do that as well, but it's a bit slow, right? You play rook d1, you have to watch out for a5 type moves all the time, a5, a4 maybe, trying to break up your pawns. So Carlsen tries to do something a bit faster. So someone recommended e4, but again, the problem with e4 is you're actually trading off your opponent's weakness. And although it makes sense because the king on e7 is quite weak, so maybe after like for example, if I go for e4 takes rook e1, for instance, maybe the king will have to move back to f8 or something. But the fact is that you are trading off a big weakness that your opponent has, right? So you have to be a little bit cautious with that. So rook a5 again looks nice, but the problem is the pawn on c5 kind of blocks you, so I'd say your rook on a5 is a little out of play there. So the reason this is hard, I think, for you guys, because I do think his move is probably the best move, almost for sure. Not just for positional reasons, but for concrete reasons as well. The reason why this is so hard is because probably when you're looking at this position, you don't think of this piece as misplaced. But it actually is, and that piece, believe it or not, is the knight on d4. The knight on d4, it's one of those things that people kind of get awestruck by knights like this. They're like, oh man, it's such a beautiful knight, it does so much. And the fact is, the knight on d4 is good, but it doesn't really attack anything. And sometimes it's very important to ask yourself, okay, is this piece really good? Can I do more with it? And the fact is, the knight on d4 can actually do a lot more somewhere else. So I see king g1 and g4 mentioned. Again, playing for g4 makes sense, but with the king on f2 is just too weak. And if king g1, I can probably play, for example, rook h8, threatening rook h1. And I think that this is actually a step in the wrong direction for you. So I would recommend something else. So once again, I think you actually have to improve this knight on d4. So b5 was already suggested, which again, I don't think is a bad move. I think it's quite promising. But he chooses to go for something else. King Lord Pi, very nice. So knight e2. And again, it looks weird at first, right? Because the knight on d4 looks so pretty. But the fact is that the knight going to f4 is actually going to be even stronger because it hits the rook, it hits the pawn on d5. If a knight lands on d5, the black king's going to be unhappy. And playing g5 cuts off the rook, so that then bishop takes d5 or some simple move like that is just going to be very strong. So believe it or not, this very simple move almost makes black's position entirely fall apart. So knight e2 to f4 is like a really, really nice maneuver. And it's one of the things that, it's a very advanced maneuver, not because it's so hard to see by itself, but because it's so easy to forget that the knight on d4 can be improved, even though it's such a nice piece. So yeah, knight f4 coming, and the fact is that after knight f4, black already has some issues here. Because the rook and pawn are forked, and you can retreat along the h-file, but then I can simply take on d5, and I have a really nice position. So for example, if the rook goes back, I can take on d5, take with the bishop, and even though I've only won a pawn, and I'm still down a pawn for an exchange technically, the two bishops are really powerful, and I would say that this pawn on b5 is a very big weakness here. So this is the kind of position where I think that white would enjoy a very nice advantage. So Adams decides instead to try to hold on to the pawn, to try to be a little greedier, basically saying that even though the rook on g5 looks out of play, and I think it is, holding on to the d-pawn is important because it keeps white's pieces at bay. If black gets to hold on to that d-pawn, it's much harder for white to crash through. So Carlsen, though, decides that it's extremely important here to make sure he crashes through with his pieces. And once again, he finds a really, really nice idea for white. Ibrahim, taking with the bishop's also possible. But the drawback to that would be if I play bishop takes, knight takes, and move my king, you've checked me, and your knight on d5 is very good, but it doesn't attack as much. I would say even though the knight on d5 looks nice, I think a bishop there would be more useful as far as attacking pieces, because the pawn on b7 is such a weakness, and the bishop on b5 attacks it while the knight doesn't. So that would be kind of my answer to that. Although you might be right that taking with the bishop is also promising. So rook d1, again, is Again, I would call it a slower move. You're attacking the pawn, but let's say you play rook d1, and I play rook d8. It's a little unclear to me how you're going to continue attacking, because I'm pretty well defended here. e4, I think I can take. It takes on f7, I can take here. So what I'm talking about is this. So you can't quite go for these tactics. Taking on f7 leads to takes on d1. If you take on d8, I can take with the knight, of course, to not drop a piece, and I think I'm doing fine. So somehow this kind of idea just doesn't work, and obviously you're not going to play e4, but if you don't play e4, it's very hard to attack the d5 pawn. I would say that white still has great compensation, don't get me wrong, because black can't really do that much. But the fact is that you don't really have a clear way to improve your position. So rook d1, again, is one of those moves where I think it looks really nice, but it's just not well suited to the position. So the Belgica, I see a really nice suggestion, and that is for b5, which was what was played in the game, which is a really nice move. So one of the trickiest things to do in chess, I would say, is to know when to kind of go for a move like b5, when to strike, and when to improve a piece. So the general rule I use is I ask myself, can my opponent improve their pieces better than I can? So if we take our initial position, here I would say we still have pieces to improve. We have a knight to improve. In particular, bringing it to f4, we still have a lot of improvements we can make. And I would say that when that's the case, oftentimes you'd rather improve than to simply like try to lash out with a pawn move. Whereas when we take this position, we've already kind of improved our pieces to the max. Our pieces are all really nice. The rook on g5 is a little bit odd, but black will improve if given time. So this is the kind of position where playing quickly, I think, makes a lot more sense. So yeah, b5 I think is a really nice move. And someone's asking, won't we end up with a weak, maybe isolated c-pawn? And that's absolutely correct. But this is something I actually talked about earlier today, I think when I did my Twitch stream for the club, where I was talking about how, and actually maybe it was even in a lecture earlier where I said, they're blurring together at the moment, where I talked about how GMs in general tend to prioritize piece play more than other players, and pawn structure and stuff like that actually less. Even though it sounds weird, you think of, GMs is all about like nuanced play and stuff like that, and it's true, but the fact is that pawn structure matters to an extent, but the fact is that maximizing your pieces, being able to create threats, tends to matter more than how your pawns look. So after bishop takes b5, which of course is forced, you can't really retreat, and a takes b5, of course, runs into rook takes a8, which would just be very bad. So the bishop has to take, knight takes d5. And you can see how the two bishops, your knight on d5, black's just getting attacked horribly here. And even though it's an endgame, this is really about active piece play and about initiative. And you'll find that endgames are like this a lot more than you'd think. So after knight takes d5 check, I think that it's already, black has to be very careful just to stay in the game. So maybe the best option was to play rook takes d5, with the idea that you sack the exchange back, and then activate your rook. So the idea is that if white tries to take this pawn kind of carelessly, you have this check and winning a piece. So probably white should play a move like e4 to consolidate the bishop. But maybe now you can even play a move like rook d7, just trying to solidify. And while I definitely think white's better, even though it's even material, the two bishops are really powerful here. But I would say that black's not like lost by any means, and I think that black could fight on here pretty well. But black instead decided to try to be a little bit, I don't know if I want to say greedier, but trying to sack the exchange back at a more opportune moment, and played king f8. So the question is how to continue the initiative here as white. What do you guys think? So notice how the knight on d5 is very powerful, but the reason why it's so powerful is because it's backed up by the two bishops and by other pieces. Just by itself, the knight is often not so great. It needs friends, you know? So how to continue now? What do you guys think? Is the point of the endgame just to queen a pawn? I would say no. Queening a pawn is often how you'll win an endgame, but a lot of the times, especially when there are lots of pieces on the board like there are now, there's a lot of dynamics that come way before that. And a lot of endgames don't even come to someone queening a pawn. Often there's a resignation or someone's kind of dead lost way before then. So I wouldn't say that it's all about queening pawns, but queening pawns becomes a lot more significant in the endgame, that's for sure. So knight c7, you guys spot it right away. So yeah, knight b4 doesn't quite do as much, but knight c7, and again, this is something that I think it's a basic thing, but it's forgotten by lots of people, which is that you want to look at the moves that threaten your opponent first, always. And it doesn't matter whether it's a middle game or an end game or an opening. Knight c7 immediately attacks a rook and threatens knight e6, which in turn forks the two pieces. So you always want to look for attacking moves before you look at retreating moves, right? Or building moves. So attacking moves always come first, and it's a good habit to get into. So rook d8 was played. So of course Adam saw that he was going to get forked to death with knight e6 check here. But the fact is that he really didn't have a choice at this point. So I think he was just trying to sack the exchange back in a more favorable manner. He plays king e8. And this is the kind of move which I really like. I don't know that it's necessarily clearly the best, but I really like kind of what this move signifies, the kind of approach that Carlsen takes here. So this is white's move. What would you guys do? So knight takes d8, of course, is a perfectly good move. There's nothing wrong with taking that rook. Taking the rook on g5 I wouldn't recommend because it allows rook d2 check, which I think is not a complication you really need or want. But taking the rook on d8 is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with taking that rook. But I really like kind of the approach he takes here. So bishop f6, gf6, I'm not sure how you're helping your position, unfortunately. I think you're giving away a bishop. And it's okay, guys. Remember, like, we've all suggested bad moves in our lifetime. I have to remind people of this when I do streams a lot, that people are hesitant to suggest moves, and it's like, I've suggested and played way more bad moves than most people will in a lifetime. You know, it's quite okay. So, you know, if you think you have a good idea, then definitely say it, and if you're wrong, it's not a big deal, right? But it's definitely a good habit to try to think your idea through a little bit more, right? Like, don't just, like, if you see an attacking move, don't just be like, well, that has to be good, you know. Knight g7, again, you're giving away too many pieces, because knight g7, rook g7, bishop f6, you're forking the rooks, but you were already forking the rooks, right? And you're giving away a knight in the process, so... yeah, so what I'm talking about is, like, trying to do this is a really cool idea, but let's say I do something like this, and for example, actually that's a bad move because I'm allowing you to take here, which is not what I should be doing. But let's say in this position I play like rook h7, right? So now my rook's threatening to move, and if you take it, I take back with, say, a knight. Now all of a sudden you have these three pawns, but I have an extra piece. And the reason I have an extra piece is because you kind of gave it away on g7. So I would say that even though it's kind of an exciting move, you don't really get enough for two pawns. I'd say a piece for two pawns is not enough. Knight c7 check is possible, but then let's say I move back, maybe even back to f8, maybe back to e7, I don't know. The problem is now rook d2 check is a serious threat, and the knight on c7 doesn't actually do that much. So that's not exactly a move I would think about too much. I gave it away with my move, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is a tricky one. He played bishop d4. And again, this is the kind of move which is like, I think of like an iconic Carlsen move, but really, like, Karpov kind of played moves like this too. But the idea is that it basically says, look, you can't save a rook, so I'm not in a rush to take one. I'm simply going to consolidate my pieces. And the bishop on d4 cuts off the rook on d8. And I know you could be thinking, well, you could have just taken the rook, which is true. But it keeps the rook cut off. It guards both the c-pawn and the e-pawn. And it asks black what they're doing, because it's not so easy to actually save these rooks. The rook on g5 can't really move anywhere great, because the g7 pawn hangs as well in a lot of cases. And taking the bishop doesn't really help your cause, because if you take and I take with the e-pawn, all of a sudden this rook on g5 is still horrible, and it's probably going to be lost. So it's a really cool move just in that it's basically like, look, I'm just going to improve my pieces and let you get out of the fork. You know, I'm not going to make your life easier by just taking a rook. So this is the kind of thing that, again, Carlsen is really good and you can really learn from. And in complex endings, this is the kind of move that happens a lot, where you're basically like, you know what, I'm going to just build my position even though I could take something, because oftentimes the tension favors you. And in this case, having that knight on e6, making black uncomfortable, there's no reason to disrupt that tension, because it makes it harder for black, not for white, in my opinion. And I would say this is something, again, that you'll notice GMs in general, but particularly Carlsen and really great technical players like to do. They like to make the tension uncomfortable for you so that you're the one who flinches first. But just in general, bishop d2 is just a really nice improving move. So Adams plays bishop d7 to basically say, look, buddy, you're going to take one of my rooks. So he obliges. Takes on d8. Knight takes d8. You have to take with the knight because otherwise your knight on f7 will hang. And he improves a rook. Rook h1. e4. So again, just improving in the center. Knight e6. Bishop back to e3. Rook e5. So again, this rook that, you know, Adams played rook g5, which was quite sensible, trying to keep a little bit, like trying to hold on to the d5 pawn. But the fact is that this rook is now causing him all sorts of problems. So rook h7. Bishop c2. So the idea is that he wants to play f4. f4. So probably actually Adams should have sacked in exchange with rook takes e4. And here I actually think that there are some drawing chances, because you can grab this exchange, but the bishop on c6, the knight on e6, it's at least relatively solid. So I definitely think that black should be doing quite, like white should be doing well here. Obviously white's up in the exchange, it's not enough compensation, but it definitely would be at least challenging to win, just because you're covering the b7 weakness, and it's very difficult to break down that kind of fortress sometimes. So I think sacking the exchange this way would have been better. He chose bishop takes e4. And he plays rook h8 check to make sure the rook's not hanging here. And then this was a really, really nice move. So I'm going to have you guys find it. And yes, Siddharth, I would say that there's definitely, piece domination is a good way to describe it. You just have really great pieces, and it makes it very difficult. So what would you do as white here? Again, this is the kind of position where accuracy is paramount, because sometimes one inaccurate move will make the win so much harder for you. And these are the kind of positions where I think that people get too complacent and they just try to play a quick move. And oftentimes you play a quick move and then you're all of a sudden the easy win that you had or the really nice position can kind of get worse. So I see a bunch of suggestions for c6. That's an interesting move. I guess my main complaint with it would be, what happens if I simply take this? If I take with the bishop, then of course you're taking my rook. But what happens if I just take the pawn? Because the problem now is if you take my rook and I take here, you've simplified the game. Yes, I have two weak pawns here, but I feel like you're only going to have, probably you're going to have to take on f6. I'll take back. You're only going to have one pawn left in an exchange up position. And I'd say that even if you win both my pawns, and I don't think you will be able to, I don't think this is going to be so clear. So I really, really don't care for this move, c6. I see a suggestion for rook b8, and this is indeed the correct move. Very nice. So the idea of this move is that if the bishop takes on c2, you don't have to take the rook right away. You throw in a little intermezzo check, and this is just deadly, because now you're going to take the rook, and the c-pawn is going to be in enormous strength. So this move forces Adams to play a very passive move, which is knight to d8. And whenever you can force your opponent to play passively, it tends to work in your favor. That's at least my experience. So after f takes e5, bishop takes c2. Why not f takes e5? Yeah, so, I mean, you could have played f takes e5 right here, right? But again, I take back, and then the bishop comes back to e4 and guards the b7 weakness. And again, I think your life is very difficult. It's kind of similar to the position we were looking at before, where I'd say that, again, even though maybe you can win, it's not so easy because it's reduced material. The bishop on c6 is very solid. So the idea of rook b8 is to force black to make a piece worse before you do anything. So again, it's all about these little subtleties that make life a lot more difficult. Because now black has to play a passive move. So now after takes, you have a similar position, except that black has a knight on d8. And sometimes one passive piece is all you need. So Carlsen takes on f6 gf, and here finds a really, really nice maneuver to further weaken black's position and make it so that it's impossible to hold on to all the pawns and hold on to his position. So once again, what is the really, really nice maneuver? This is going to be more than one move, by the way, guys. So I'm not looking for a single move suggestion. But basically, how do you make it so that black can no longer hold on to the position? And keep in mind, it's probably something fast. If you just bring your king in or improve some other piece, most likely black will be able to play bishop e4, bishop c6, and consolidate the position somewhat. So you need to be able to do something very precise. So I see bishop d4. The question after bishop d4 is what happens. So you're threatening bishop takes f6 check. But what happens if I play f5 there? Bishop d2 to a5 is possible, but it's also slow. So after bishop d2, for example, I can play bishop a5. And if bishop here, I can simply move away, and my bishop guards the b7 pawn. I put my bishop on c6. I'd say black has excellent drawing chances there. So g4, g5 is definitely an interesting possibility, actually. g4, I was considering this because now if bishop e4, g5, you can't take this pawn, which is kind of annoying. But I might be curious, maybe black can play knight e6 here? So you don't want to take it, of course, but I guess you could play g6, but I might be able to take that g6 pawn. You only have one pawn left. Sometimes it's just not enough. So g4, g5 is possible, but again, you're risking liquidating the game a little bit more. I think the way he does it is a little bit cleaner. So I did see a suggestion for the first move, but again, I need more than one move, right? Again, c6 is possible, but I take with the pawn, and I'm not so sure you've actually helped yourself that much. Because again, we just have limited material here. When it's limited material, you have to be so precise. Because you allow one extra pair of pawns to trade, it often means you can't win. Because again, c6, bc, rook b6, you might win one of my pawns, but we've just traded a pair of pawns. Trading a pair of pawns doesn't really help you. So you have to make sure that you try to keep as many pawns on as possible while forcing your opponent to maybe relinquish one of their pawns. Basically what I'm saying is win a pawn for free. Don't just trade them. If you exchange the bishop for the knight, I'd say it depends on the situation, right? Like if I have a really active rook and a king running up, maybe I can win, but I would say it depends on the situation. So king f3, again, is a decent looking move, right? You're just trying to improve your pieces, but it's also a little slow. So for example, if I play bishop a4, trying to put my bishop on c6, and here, and then maybe bishop c6, for example, so I can move my knight, maybe you have some chances here, but I would also say that black has good defensive chances once I establish this kind of setup. So again, it's a nice idea, but I would say it's a little bit slow. You want to do something a bit faster. So bishop d4 was played in the game, f5. So bishop f6 is definitely a tempting move, trying to simplify the game. But the problem is you still have to deal with this position after bishop e4 to c6. And again, it's just really annoying. The bishop goes to c6, I just guard everything. And you can try to win this f5 pawn, and maybe that's even winning. But I would say that this is at least challenging. This is not a simple win. And anytime you can make your life a little bit easier, because this you can blow. It's very possible not to win a position like this. So you always want to look to see if you have anything better. And after bishop d2, f4, white has a really, really nice move, which makes his life a lot easier. And I think free ZFX Graphics got it. Very nice. Maybe someone else got it also, but the idea is you simply go back. So it looks weird, right? You play bishop d4 to provoke the pawn forward. But the idea now is you're threatening bishop g5 check, and there's no real great solution. You don't have time to play bishop e4, so you have to move your king, which is what he does. But now after bishop g5, you have to let go of your b7 pawn, and this is kind of the crucial idea. But it had to be well calculated because black has knight e6, and again, if you just trade pawns, this is not so clear at all. Even if you win a6 and b7 and lose c5, I would say that black has some drawing chances there because it's such reduced position. But after takes king c8, the idea here is that if king c6, which looks like a really annoying move, you have this move rook b6. And this makes life really, really annoying for him. Because now, if here, you have all sorts of different options. Even moves like c6, c7 just become possible. And I would say that here, black's going to have some problems. At the very least, you can play this, maybe even bishop back and just defend a pawn. But I would say that here, it's here white's doing pretty well. So he chooses to go back to c8 instead. Rook to c2, rook to b2, another precise move. And again, keep in mind, he had to calculate all this before he went into this sequence. It wasn't like he went into the sequence without seeing this. But the key is he's taking advantage of this loose bishop on c2. So the bishop goes back. He goes bishop e7. Knight f4. And here the game concluded after rook a2. King d7. Bishop d6. So he grabs this pawn, and even though white only has one pawn left, the problem black has is that this knight on g2 is completely out of the game. And the pawn on c6, on c5, if it ever gets moving, is just going to be a deadly force. So even though this knight, even though it looks like black's really reduced material, just the one pawn and the trapped knight on g2 really decide the game. So it's one of those things where it really helps to remember that, like, the quality of the pieces matters. It's not just how many pawns are left or how many pieces are left. The quality of your pieces matters. And I would say that the knight on g2, even though the material is so reduced, the knight on g2 is so bad that it makes it so that you don't really have any drawing chances here. So he tries f4, which is understandable. And here Carlsen finds one last accurate sequence. And again, there's probably more than one way to win here, so you guys might find something else. But I would say find his last accurate sequence, which enabled him to win. So I see a bunch of suggestions for bishop takes f4. This move maybe does it, but you have to be careful because I think after knight takes, which is your move? Because if you play this, I think I can play knight e6. And keep in mind, if you lose your c-pawn, even if you win a piece back, that's not going to be enough to win, right? So you can't take on e4 right away anyway. If you take here, this is a draw on king and pawn endgame, which you guys hopefully know these. Because after this here you play king c8, and this is known to be a draw. And if you play rook a7 check, I think I can just play king up. And again, I'm just gonna take your pawn. So if you play rook a6 check, I still take your pawn. If king e4, I play knight c5. This is a way to kind of spoil all your hard work. So you have to be very careful of doing this, yeah. Because it's so easy to, think like do all this work. You think, I should have a tactical win here and play bishop takes f4. So I'd say being accurate till the very last move is just so important in all these positions. So I've seen the move, but I haven't seen the sequence. So remember, don't just suggest one move, suggest a sequence. So again, bishop takes f4 I think is not good enough, guys. So I see bishop b8. This might be good enough. I mean, you're kind of keeping black really paralyzed. So a move like bishop e8 probably would do the trick. I don't really see any great solution. Rook b6 check, rook d6 check maybe is coming, or even rook f6 is very nice and clean. So I would say this is good enough. But again, you always look at your forcing moves at forced sequences before you look at moves that are not forcing. Sometimes in the endgame, it's easier to actually play non-forcing moves and win that way. But in most cases, at least at some point, a forcing variation is what you're going to need to look for. And a forcing variation is what ends the game here. Rook a7 check, king c6, rook c7 check, king d5, rook e7. These are all very promising ideas. I would say, though, after something like this... So after here, rook here probably does end the game, and I agree with this because I think that these pieces are really awkward, the king and bishop. But after rook c7 check, I might play king here, and this I'm not so sure is going to be that easy because now bishop can drop back to c6, and once again I think you've maybe made life a little harder than it has to be. So yeah, I see Avimi I think gave this line. Anvimi. Anvimi. You gave a line with rook a4 here. But again, I think I drop back to d5 and I don't exactly see the win. Maybe after rook d4 you're still winning here. But I don't know. I mean, even a move like f3 looks possible. It's at least a little bit messy still, I think. At least not like 100% clear. Probably this should be winning though, I would say. Maybe even a Zugzwang move like this. Just forcing me to move. Or maybe bishop f8, I don't know. Yeah, it should be winning. He chooses a different way though. So he does start with rook a4. A lot of you guys are on the money with that one because it basically forces the bishop to move to a certain square. If the bishop were to move to, say, b7, then yes, I think you can take this pawn. You have to be careful. Sometimes these kind of positions are not so easy. But here I think the problem is that the king is ready to play to d4 2 moves. So if like bishop d5, I can even play like king e3, king d4. And if king here, I can play here. And once again, king e3, king d4 is just too fast. So that should be a very easy win if you hang on to your pawn. So black does play bishop c6 here. But the question is, what is the key maneuver now? Because taking f4, basically black's taking away your time, so you can't just take on f4. I don't know about king in the wrong corner. I would say that as long as black has an extra pawn, then as long as white has that c pawn, it should be a win. Without the c pawn, it should be a draw. Like you can't force the king to a8. Although that would be the wrong corner. Yes, the bishop would rather be on the dark squares, but I'd say that you can't force the king to a8, which you'd need to do there. So it doesn't quite apply. So a lot of you are saying rook a7 check, which is the key. So if the king has to move to the back rank, I think it's bad news for lots of reasons, and there are probably many wins. He chooses to go here instead. And the question is, what is the move now? What move forced Adams to finally resign? So I see rook d7, but that would hang the rook. So I assume you guys mean rook e7? But after rook e7, maybe king f6 or king f5, I don't know. I think I'm still playing. So the correct move is rook a6. The idea is that if the bishop moves to b5 or bishop b5 or bishop d7, b7, I can play rook b6, it's hitting the bishop again. And the main idea is that if the bishop now moves, I can take this pawn with check. And this should be an extremely easy win. Say king here, I could even just start pushing the pawn at some point, but just bishop d6 for instance. Or if I want to be really fancy, I could even play bishop e3 because the bishop's going to be attacked on e4 if takes. So you don't have time to take back this pawn. This is a fancy way to do it, probably unnecessary, but the idea is that you take the pawn with check, so it becomes quite easy. And if you defend the bishop, of course, you grab it and take here, and this is also a very easy win. So once again, it's mainly winning largely because that knight on g2 is such a bad piece. So it's kind of a nice little winning maneuver. But notice how he had lots of these maneuvers in the game. Like he had the knight e2 to f4 was kind of the start of it, and then later he had all this little fancy stuff with like playing the bishop on d4, delaying the capture, the rook to b8 move before taking back the piece. So basically, there are lots of subtleties in these kind of endings. And then finally, this sidestep with the bishop, right, where he plays check and rook a6. Because it's a 4-move sequence or 3-move sequence, right? He does this, bishop c6, gives the check, and then goes here. And that is what ends the game. So it's one of those where subtleties make a difference when you're dealing with endgames this complex, right? So you want to make sure that you pay attention and give these kind of their full attention, because sometimes one little accurate sequence can make such a big difference. So it's kind of a cool game. So I'm going to move to another one. And again, this is a game I've given to students, I've lectured on, and I find it to be just a really interesting exercise. Again, it really demonstrates the power of the pieces in the endgame. So let me pull it up. And I believe this should be it. Let me just make sure yep. And I'll flip this one around because this one is from the black point of view. And white played the move knight e6. Hey Tarun, so I stream myself. I stream myself a few times a week, usually, probably less now that I'm doing this stuff for the club. And I also give private lessons and stuff like that. And I do have my own YouTube channel, actually. So you can Google me there. It's just Josh Friedel. Just my name. So, and I'm a private coach. So yeah, I do all that stuff. So whatever you were looking for, I'm sure it can be done. So this one is black to move. So this was Sam Shankland, 2,700 player now. Well, maybe a bit under, but you know, one of the main members of the American team. And believe it or not, actually a former student of mine. I taught him when I lived in California, maybe 10 plus years ago, something like that. About 10 years ago, I worked with him when he was about 2,200 or so. And obviously he became a lot stronger than me. So I'm willing to take credit now. He had lots of coaches. I was just one of many. But it was kind of cool to see like someone who I've worked with quite a bit become that strong. So he was black in this game against Soto Vega, who's a 2350 player from Peru, I believe. And this was in the Continental Championships in 2018, which he actually went on to win. But he played lots of really great games in that sequence because I think he won 3 tournaments in a row. So I was kind of keeping my eye on him, not just because I knew him, but because usually I like to follow people who are doing really well at a certain time, because oftentimes you can learn a lot from their games because they're really just clicking, they're playing lots of positions well. And this game actually, even though it was kind of against a low-rated player by his standards, it was still just a really striking how he won this position, seemingly without that much effort, because he's not even up a pawn here. As you guys can see, it's like he has an active king. His position looks very promising. White's king, I'd say, is really bad. But to win a position like this with relative ease is actually quite something. But again, it's all about these little details. Have I taught many people who are now 2,700 plus? No. I have worked with Sam. He's the strongest player who I've worked with so far. And again, it was like 10 years ago or so, and I worked with him when he was in the 2200s. For a little while. It was more informal than formal, I'd say, but I definitely spent a lot of time working with him. And then I'm currently actually working with a Wonder Liang, who is a very strong GM, but not 2700. But again, it's always nice for me, you know, even if students become better than me, it's like it's a nice feeling, you know. But I've definitely, you know, worked with my share of very promising students. I've been quite fortunate. So, okay. So this one is black to move. And again, this is a very tricky one. So you guys might have to spend a minute or two because it's a very complicated position and you're not finding a win or anything crushing here. The key is how do you sort out your position, because these knights are just threatening to check you all over the place. So it looks like such a promising thing. For example, just to give you an example of a bad move, do not suggest this move, guys. Rook a6 looks like a great move because you're going to play rook to a1 check and checkmate the king, which, by the way, playing for checkmate in the endgame, always fun. But you walk into a knight fork with knight c5 check. And this is highly problematic, to say the least. So the key is you have to find a solution. How do you... Because you want to attack. You really are playing for an attack here against white's king. And it's something that people forget you can do in the endgame, that you can play for an attack. But you need some way to sort out your pieces. Like, sort out these knight forks, because these knight forks are going to drive you nuts. So... Okay, Tarun, sounds great, actually. Thank you very much. So what would you like to do? And again, I would say you want to have a specific idea behind your approach, right? Like, don't just suggest a move, but like, what exactly would your idea be? I see a suggestion for king c4, which makes a lot of sense because it makes it so that this knight on e6 can't check you as much. But even here, you can run into issues. For example, I might be able to try rook f4 check, and then knight check here. And sometimes these kind of things are annoying because I'm threatening knight a4 check as well. Although even these things are complicated, right? Because if takes check here, so you can't move your king because then I give a rook check, but probably you take it, king a3. And the idea is that if I take this, then you can check here and take this. But then I play this, then I play, say, knight here, and then try to go after your king side, and it's just a mess, right? Like, I honestly have no idea what's going on here. Maybe it's good for you because you have the extra a-pawn. And that was pretty fast, right? This is all crazy tactics. And maybe I don't have to play rook f4 check either. But it's definitely one of the things I would be slightly worried about, at least. I have other moves as well. Maybe moves like rook d2 are kind of annoying. And main idea is to get the king out. So I would say king c4 is not a bad move, but I would say that it's maybe not as precise as you could be. But honestly, king c4 to me looks like a very reasonable choice. It's just not what he chose. So bishop takes g2 is possible, but keep in mind I don't have to take you back, right? Because I can throw in this check and then the g2 bishop hangs. So you have to be very careful about moves like this, especially when I have all these checks. The ready. Yeah, I mean, honestly though, I would say that right now there's a huge amount of opening stuff out there. As far as books, as far as lectures and stuff, because the fact is that I think most players who are amateur players who are trying to improve spend way too much time on learning and opening and it's honestly like for most people they have to improve at so many other things. They have to learn more endgames, they have to become stronger tactically, they have to become better middle game players. Like I would say the openings are the most like overstudied part of the game for most players, not for everyone, of course. If you don't have a great repertoire, if you're struggling out of the opening every time, probably it's something to work on. But I would say that for most players, that's kind of overstudied. But the advantage of this is that there's tons of opening stuff out there. So regardless of what you're looking for, you should be able to find plenty of opening stuff out there. Like you can always find ways to improve your openings. It's the easiest part of the game to improve, for sure. So hardest type of endgame, I mean, honestly, the most complex I've seen are certain queen endgames are really hard because it looks easy, but you have so many moves at your disposal and everything so many moves deep that calculating it's almost impossible, or at least very difficult. And there's no alternative to it. They're not intuitive. So I would say a lot of those endgames are very tricky. But honestly, any type of endgame, like even just rook endgames, like rook and pawn against rook, can be really, really tough. I'd say the key in the endgame is to assume it's difficult until you kind of prove otherwise, because a lot of people assume endgames are much simpler than they are. So yeah, I mean, I like the idea of Anvimi, which is that you want to trade a pair of pieces, because if you simplify, the black king is going to be stronger than the white king. So I don't mind the idea of trading a pair of pieces, but you have to determine which piece. If you trade just into a rook endgame, it's unclear that you can win that easily. So it's almost like you'd like to trade one pair of minors, but not another. And you also have to make sure to kind of attack other things. So I would say the way you study the middle game, by the way, is you go over games. Like, you see what players are doing, you try to solve positions, you try to solve complex calculation exercises, things like that. You learn how to plan. There's so many ways to try to improve, but just the fact is that improving parts of the game that aren't the opening is just a lot harder, because there's just a lot less out there. It's a lot more difficult. Yeah, no, queen end games are absolutely insane a lot of the time. Yeah, so knight e4, again, the main problem I have, oops, I was trying to actually move it on YouTube. That was pretty hilarious. Instead of on my chess base. Yeah, knight e4 is definitely a tempting move, but again, after takes, first of all, I also have rook f3 check moves you have to maybe concern yourself with, but takes, I am assuming maybe bishop takes. The problem is you're actually simplifying too much. I do this, I take here. You have chances in this rook endgame, but rook endgames, I'd say, the problem is you can't stop me from activating my king at some point now. And once I get my king active, I think the win is just going to be really difficult. I can also try to activate my rook, maybe bring it over to a3 to attack your a pawn. It just becomes really, really tricky to win a position like this. You still have chances, of course, because you have the better king. But I'd say that overall it just becomes really tricky to win. So honestly, this is just a really, really difficult one. I haven't checked out the woodpecker method yet, so I have actually no idea. But a lot of people I know seem to like it, so. So the move here, believe it or not, played in the game was bishop a8. And this is a really, really hard move to find. But the main idea is that the bishop is just always getting forked and in the way. So you just get it out of the way. You put the bishop on a8 and say, look, the bishop is no longer going to be a problem. And it's kind of amazing, like, probably the best try might be something like knight c7, but then I can play bishop back to e4, and this knight on c7 is actually just not a good piece. So he tried knight c5 check, and here, once again, he should play knight d7, I think, to try to activate this piece. But even here, you can play rook e6, heading for e1, rook check, and believe it or not, here you have a super fancy move, which is rook e4. The idea being that if you trade, and this is the one advantage, though, of having a great king. If you trade off the minor pieces, the rook endgame is still going to be tough. But if you trade off the rooks, this king on c4 is just going to walk and take the b pawn, and that a pawn is going to be nasty. Knights are horrible at defending against a pawns. So I see some sarcasm. Bishop a8 is a very intuitive move. Yeah, it's really, really difficult. But the key thing to realize is that the bishop is in the way. You need it out of the way. So knight takes e4, knight e2 check is the fancy thing. And the problem is white has now is that the g2 and h3 pawns are very weak, and the king is so active on c4. So I would say black has excellent winning chances here. But white played this move, which I think is just putting a knight on too bad of a square. Like, the knight on a4 is just really bad. So Sam played rook d6, rook f4 check, king b3, king f2, g5. The rook went to g4. And this is, I'd say, one of the few areas of the game where I think Sam misplayed it. I think that he could have played it a little bit better now. He played the move bishop c6, attacking the knight. So Sam is, I'd say, a very concrete player. So he's always looking for those kind of forced lines and forced wins, which I think is, in a lot of positions, a really good thing. And dude was 2,700 plus at this time, so he was definitely, it was working for him, let's put it that way. But I'd say in this particular position, a better method would be to think about control. How do I make it to paralyze white? Rather than thinking, purely about attacking stuff. So what would be a really great idea to paralyze white? And again, this is not just one move, so you're looking for a 2-move sequence here. So rook d2 is possible, but after rook d2, I think I bring my king. Yeah, so this actually rook d2 here is a really interesting move. I think one of my students suggested this when I was showing this problem to him, and one of the cool ideas here is that knight e3, believe it or not, walks into knight f1 mate, which is quite nasty. So I think king e1 is a better try, and then rook takes g2, and probably rook takes g5, I think is the move. But the fact is that you're reducing material again, so whenever you do that, you make it so that a draw becomes at least a little bit closer, usually. So I would say that while this is still very promising for black, I'd say that it's not as clean as you could be. Again, you want to think more control than immediate, like just forcing trying to take stuff. Think about how Carlsen played that last game. He really emphasized control, the moves like bishop d4, just trying to put a clamp on his opponent's position. And here I think that if you can control the knights, if you can control the rook, if you can control what white can do, you can actually just win very easily here. Very nice, Anvimi. Rook f6. So king e3, for example, rook f5. And this is excellent control play, because the rook on g4 has almost no moves. The knight on a4 can no longer go to c5, where it would cause trouble. And you're just going to collect g2 and h3 and ask white to resign, pretty much. So this is an example of an excellent kind of prophylactic move in a very complex position. But the idea is you just guard everything with the rook on f5. So because you notice how you're guarding your pawn, you're guarding against the knight, and you're cutting off the king so that this pawn is just going to be weak. So the bishop can simply take it. Just because the bishop's far away doesn't mean it can't take it. So rook g4. So instead he played bishop c6, which is also a good move, but probably not quite as precise. Here white had the opportunity to sacrifice the b pawn and play this, and this looks kind of weird, but somehow the rook and two knights are they're kind of a hassle. They can harass the king a little bit, and it's not so easy to win here. But this is not easy to see. His opponent played king e1, which I think is a poor move. And here Sam came up with a really nice idea, which is he plays king c2, knight c5. And again, this is such a complex ending. Going a little faster than I intended. Just, again, I just want to make sure that the lecture doesn't go 2 hours. Because believe me, you can look at this game a long time. I actually looked at this game with a wonder. When we were doing a lesson, I gave this position to him, and we spent like an hour and a half easily because it's so complex. But the fact is, I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what to look for, how to play these complex positions. So a lot of the times it's about, you have to look for force sequences. Sometimes you have to think about playing kind of more control. But this is just a really, really nice idea for black. So what would you do here? I see a lot of suggestions in the chat. Yeah. And this was the idea of playing king c2, by the way. That you're not necessarily just eyeing the b2 pawn, you're actually eyeing checkmate. And believe it or not, the only way to prevent checkmate is by sacking the exchange. Rook f1 is so powerful. Hey Dorsa, how's it going? Dorsa, by the way, if you've missed her lectures, you definitely shouldn't. She gives excellent lectures on here. Good friend of mine, so always good to see her. Anyway, so rook f6, and the main idea is you're threatening rook f1, and this checkmate is just going to be really, really tough to deal with. But again, notice how even though it's an endgame, even though it's fairly reduced, you're still playing for dynamics, you're still playing for checkmate, you're still playing for tactical ideas. And it's just something that so many people forget about. But yeah, hey Divina, how's it going? Man, all my friends are showing up just then. It's kind of cool. Anyway, so rook f1 is just unstoppable here. So rook takes g3 was played, but now it's a fairly simple win. White plays knight e2, and here black simply takes and pushes, which is the easiest way because the a pawn's just gonna make a new queen, or you're gonna have to sack a knight for it. So once again, I hope you enjoyed those games. There are two really complex positions, two really complicated games. So if you didn't see all the continuations, if you didn't spot everything, it's not such a big deal. Like, it's really hard, and these of course are very strong players who you're trying to emulate, but the more important thing is to kind of learn the concepts from this. So when you're playing these complex end games, you have to almost treat them a little like middle games, in that you're always looking for, you still are looking for attacks, you're still looking for tactics, but at the same time, you're often trying to activate your king. You're often trying to create dangerous pawns. So you still have to treat them like endgames, but in a lot of ways, they are like middle games as well. But learning to navigate the dynamics of these positions is just always a challenge and always something that's very interesting. So I really enjoy looking at endgames in positions like this. Yo, it's Josh. Hi. Oh my goodness. Okay. Anyway, thanks so much, guys, for watching the lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Best played for a 1300 to get better. Lots of tactics, my friend. Lots and lots of tactics. And then when you get sick of tactics, do some more tactics. I'm trying to remember. Honestly, I don't think I read either of those as far as endgames. I read something else. So, but it was a long time ago for me. But honestly, like, yeah. Probably either of those is fine. It's more important that you kind of learn the end games and make sure you go over them and do stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, everyone also has their own learning style, so it makes it tricky. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you for my next one.